There is a particular kind of stillness that comes over a house late at night. Not the comfortable quiet of a home at rest, but something else. A held breath, a tightening of the air, the sense that the darkness around you has become deliberate. Most people have felt it at least once. That moment when you're lying in bed and something shifts, and you become aware, with a certainty you cannot explain, that you are not the only thing in the room paying attention. Marcus Webb felt it for the first time on a Tuesday in late October 2019. He was 34 years old, a warehouse logistics manager living alone in a rented house in Knoxville, Tennessee. He was not, by any account, his own included, a person given to imagination. He did not believe in ghosts. He did not watch horror films. He described himself, in the written account he submitted to a paranormal documentation archive some months later, as someone who had always trusted his own perception. Someone who knew the difference between what was real and what was not. He woke at 2:47 in the morning. He was certain of the time because he checked his phone immediately, the way you do when something pulls you out of sleep and you cannot identify what it was. The room was dark. The house was quiet. And then, slowly, over the course of perhaps 30 seconds, he became aware that there was a shadow in the gap beneath his bedroom door that did not belong there. It was a subtle thing. The hallway beyond his door received faint light from a street lamp through an uncurtained window, and that light normally cast a thin, even glow under the doorframe. Marcus had lived in that house for 9 months. He knew what the gap beneath his door looked like at night. He had seen it hundreds of times in the periphery of his attention, without ever consciously registering it. What he saw that Tuesday morning was different. The light was interrupted, not completely blocked. There was still illumination coming through, but the pattern was wrong. There were sections of darkness that moved slowly, in a way that light does not move when nothing is disturbing it. He stared at the gap for what he estimated was 2 minutes. He did not move. He did not call out. He simply watched the shadow shift and settle, with the unhurried rhythm of something breathing. And then, with no transition, no sound, no explanation, the light beneath the door returned to normal, even and undisturbed, exactly as it had always been. Marcus lay awake until sunrise. He did not check the hallway. He would not be able to tell you why. That should have been the end of it. A strange moment in the middle of the night, the kind of thing you dismiss by morning. Except Marcus did not dismiss it, and the following Tuesday, at nearly the same hour, it happened again. What makes a story like Marcus Webb's worth examining is not the strangeness of it taken alone. Isolated accounts of things seen in the dark, things glimpsed in doorways and hallways and the spaces between rooms, are not rare. They exist in every culture, in every era, in the testimonies of people from wildly different backgrounds and belief systems. The skeptic's explanation is simple and usually sufficient. The human brain, particularly in the hypnagogic state between sleep and waking, is prone to error. It constructs patterns from noise. It populates darkness with shapes. That explanation covers a great deal, but it does not cover everything. Because what emerges when you look carefully at the accounts, not the sensationalized versions, not the ones filtered through television and internet mythology, but the raw, undramatic, often frustratingly mundane testimonies of ordinary people who are trying to describe something they experienced and cannot explain, is a pattern that the brain in darkness theory struggles to accommodate. The specifics are too consistent, the details too particular. The witnesses too geographically and demographically varied to have been drawing from the same cultural well. Something is happening in the gaps beneath doors, in the shadows of hallways, in the watched spaces of dark rooms across this country. It has been happening for a long time, and the people it happens to almost universally report the same thing. Not fear, exactly, in the first moment. Something more precise than that. The absolute, overwhelming physical certainty that something on the other side of the door is aware of them. To understand why this particular phenomenon, the watching presence, the figure in the doorway, the shadow that does not belong, has generated such a persistent and consistent body of testimony, it helps to start at the beginning. or as close to the beginning as the historical record allows. The earliest documented accounts in North America come largely from frontier communities, settlers in the 1700s and 1800s who described, in journals and letters and church records, experiences in their isolated cabins and farmhouses that sound, with some allowance for the language of the era, remarkably similar to what Marcus Webb would write in his online submission 200 years later. A darkness at the gap beneath the door, a sense of presence in the hallway, a shadow that moved without a source. These accounts were almost universally interpreted through a religious lens in their time. Demons, spirits, the visitations of the recently dead. The cultural framework determined the explanation, as it always does. But strip away the interpretation, and what remains is the raw perceptual experience. Something was there, in the doorway, watching. By the mid-20th century, the lens had shifted. The post-war period in America brought with it a new vocabulary for inexplicable experiences: extraterrestrial visitors, government experiments, psychological anomalies. The same basic experience was reframed. A truck driver in rural Georgia in 1953 described, in a letter to a veterans organization, waking in his motel room to see a figure standing in the gap of his partially open door. It stood motionless for what he believed was several minutes. When he reached for the bedside lamp and turned it on, the hallway beyond was empty. A woman in Portland, Oregon in 1961 wrote in her diary about a recurring presence in her home. Something she sensed rather than clearly saw, always associated with the closed door of her bedroom, always arriving in the hours between 2 and 4 in the morning. She described the shadow beneath the door in terms almost identical to Marcus Webb's account, half a century later and 2,000 miles away. She had never, to any evidence, encountered the concept she was describing in popular media. The cultural vocabulary for this specific experience did not yet fully exist. She was describing something she had seen and felt, without a ready-made framework to contain it. Researchers who have spent time cataloging these accounts, and there are a small number of people who have done exactly that, working in the margins of folklore studies and paranormal research and, occasionally, sleep science, note that the geographic spread is not clustered. These reports come from rural areas and cities, from old houses and new apartments, from people who live alone and people who live with families. The only consistent environmental factor, noted across the majority of accounts, is isolation at the time of the experience. The witness is alone in the room. The rest of the house or building is, as far as they know, empty or asleep, and the time of occurrence is strikingly consistent. The reports cluster, with notable density, in a window between approximately 2 and 4 in the morning. Sleep scientists will recognize that window immediately. It represents the period of deepest non-REM sleep for most people, the phase during which waking is most disorienting and the brain is least equipped to accurately evaluate sensory input. That overlap is the foundation of the sleep paralysis and hypnagogic hallucination explanations that dominate the mainstream conversation about these experiences. But here is what those explanations do not address. Marcus Webb was fully awake. He had checked his phone. He had sat upright in his bed. He was engaged in deliberate, conscious observation of the gap beneath his door for 2 minutes or more. He was not in a hypnagogic state. He was a man lying in his bed looking at his door, and something was there that he could not explain. He is not alone in that claim. Elena Vasquez was 29 when it started. She had moved into a ground-floor apartment in Chicago's Pilsen neighborhood in the spring of 2017, following the end of a long relationship. The apartment was in a building constructed in the 1940s, solid brick, with the kind of thick walls and heavy doors that were standard for the era. The bedroom door was solid wood, old growth, she noted, because she had been curious about the building's history and had done some research. It fit snugly in its frame. The gap beneath it was narrow but consistent. She woke the first time in March, approximately 3 weeks after moving in. It was, she checked, 3:11 in the morning. The bedroom was dark except for the thin line of hallway light under the door. She was in the process of reorienting herself, the disorientation of sleeping in a new place, not yet fully at home in the darkness, when she noticed that part of the line was gone. A section of it, roughly central, approximately the width of 2 feet, was simply absent, blocked from the other side. Elena had lived alone before. She knew immediately, with a certainty that she described as almost physical, that no one was in her apartment. She had locked the door before bed, the windows were closed. She was alone, and yet the light was blocked, and the absence of it held perfectly still for a period she estimated at 90 seconds to 2 minutes. And then it returned, and she lay completely motionless until she heard her neighbor's alarm go off through the wall at 6 in the morning. She did not report it to anyone for several months. She told herself it was a shadow from traffic outside, or something she had imagined in the space between sleep and waking. She told herself this even as it continued. Not every night, not even every week, but with enough regularity, through enough different conditions of weather and traffic and her own state of alertness, that the mundane explanations began to exhaust themselves one by one. By autumn of 2017, she had done what an increasing number of people do with experiences they cannot explain. She went looking online for accounts that matched her own. What she found was both reassuring and deeply unsettling. The reassurance came from discovering that she was not alone, that other people in other places had seen what she had seen or something very much like it. The unsettlement came from reading, carefully, what those other people had experienced as the encounters progressed, because for many of them it did not remain static. Whatever was in the doorway, it seemed over time to become more present. This is the element of the phenomenon that researchers find most difficult to categorize and most impossible to dismiss. The initial encounter, the shadow, the interruption of light, the felt presence, is strange enough. But the pattern that emerges across dozens of independent accounts suggests that the experience does not stay at that level. It develops, it intensifies, not in dramatic cinematic ways, but in small measurable increments that follow a consistent trajectory regardless of who is experiencing it or where. The second phase, described in the majority of multi-encounter accounts, involves sound. Not dramatic sound, no footsteps running, no voices, no crashes. The sound most commonly reported is a very specific kind, a subtle change in the acoustic quality of the space beyond the door. A difference in the way the room on the other side seems to breathe. Several witnesses have reached for words like presence of air, or the way a room sounds when it isn't empty, or, in one memorable account from a man in rural Virginia, the way a phone call sounds different when someone on the other end has stopped talking but hasn't hung up. That description came from a 47-year-old former electrician named Daniel Holt, who experienced the phenomenon in his farmhouse outside Roanoke over the course of approximately 8 months beginning in the winter of 2015. Daniel's account is one of the more detailed in the corpus of these reports, partly because he was systematic in his documentation. He began keeping a log after the third encounter, and partly because his background gave him an instinct for eliminating mechanical explanations methodically. The house was old, built in the 1880s, on land that had been in his family for generations. He was accustomed to the sounds it made, the wood contracting in cold weather, the pipes settling, the particular creak of the second stair from the top that he had lived with his whole life. He knew the house the way you can only know a place you have spent decades in. He knew what normal sounded like in every room, at every hour, in every season. When the presence arrived, and he used that word deliberately, presence, because it was, he said, the only word that accurately described what he felt. It arrived without any of the sounds the house normally made. The floor in the hallway outside his bedroom was old pine, and it announced every step taken on it without exception. Daniel had tested this after the third encounter, systematically, walking back and forth in the hallway at various times of night, recording how much weight was required to produce a creak, how slowly you could move and still make the boards speak. Whatever was in his hallway made no sound on those boards. Not quiet footsteps, he wrote in his log. No footsteps. The absence of footsteps where footsteps should be. He had installed a motion-sensing light in the hallway after the fourth encounter. On the fifth night, at approximately 2:30 in the morning, his bedroom went dark. The thin line of light beneath his door disappeared, and the motion sensor light did not trigger. He sat with that for a long time before writing it down. He was an electrician. He knew how motion sensors worked. He also knew that they were not infallible, that the angle of sensitivity had limits, that something very slow, very low to the ground, might not register. He replaced the sensor with a newer model and adjusted its placement. The next encounter, 2 weeks later, the same result. Darkness beneath the door. Silence in the hallway. No triggered light. It was after this that Daniel began to think carefully about what exactly he was dealing with. He had exhausted the mechanical explanations. He had ruled out animals. There were no gaps in the house's foundation large enough to admit anything significant, and the motion sensor would have caught anything of size. He had ruled out human intruders. The doors were locked, the windows were intact, and nothing in the house was ever disturbed. He had considered, seriously and at length, the possibility that he was experiencing some form of sleep disorder, some intrusion of dream state into his waking consciousness. But the log told a different story. The encounters were consistent, documentable, and they were changing. Because in the 6th month, something new began to happen. Daniel started to hear, barely from beyond the closed bedroom door, a sound he struggled to describe precisely. He wrote several drafts of the description before settling on one that satisfied him. The sound, he wrote, is like breathing, but not. It is the rhythm of breathing without the actual movement of air. The pattern of it. The pace. Like something that has learned what breathing sounds like and is reproducing the interval. That description, the reproduction of a pattern rather than the thing itself, appears in other accounts as well. Not universally, but frequently enough to constitute a recurring element. And it points towards something that makes this phenomenon genuinely difficult to fit into the standard categories of either supernatural belief or psychological explanation. Whatever is in the doorway, according to these witnesses, appears to be attentive. It appears to be learning. There is a concept in the study of unsolved experiences that researchers sometimes call the adaptation problem. It refers to the way that certain unexplained phenomena seem to respond to attempts to observe or document them, changing their behavior in response to the observer, as if aware of being watched. It is a confounding factor in almost every category of genuinely puzzling experience, and it is one of the reasons that controlled study of these phenomena is so difficult to establish. The accounts of the watching presence display the adaptation problem in a specific and consistent form. Witnesses who attempt to observe the phenomenon directly, who turn on lights, who open doors quickly, who install cameras or motion sensors, consistently report one of two outcomes. Either the presence is not there when they look, the darkness having resolved back to normal light, the hallway beyond the door empty and undisturbed, or, far more rarely but far more disturbing, what they find when they open the door is something not quite right about the space. Not something present exactly, but something about the quality of the air, the way the hallway feels, that takes a moment to identify and then lands with sudden clarity. The hallway smells differently than it should, or the temperature is wrong. Or there is, in one account from a woman in Denver named Patricia Okafor, a faint impression in the carpet in the hallway outside her door that she could not explain, and that was not there the following morning. Patricia's account is from 2020, and it is one of the clearest examples of the phenomenon reaching what might be called its third phase. She had been experiencing the initial encounters, the shadow, the interrupted light, for approximately 4 months before the carpet incident. She had been tracking the occurrences in a notes application on her phone, and she had, by the time of the carpet impression, developed a very specific procedure. She would observe the shadow from bed for as long as it was present, not moving, not speaking, simply watching. When it resolved, she would wait 15 minutes before checking the hallway. The carpet impression was the length and approximate width of a human foot. It was indented rather than flattened, as if weight had been rested on it with some duration. It was located approximately 12 inches from her bedroom door, centered in the hallway. When she photographed it and examined the image closely, she noted that it was the right foot. Just the one, as if whatever had been standing outside her door had weight enough to leave a mark, had been standing there long enough for the mark to set, and had been standing with its weight distributed in a particular way. Perhaps, she noted in her account, leaning slightly toward the door, leaning toward the door, toward her. She was careful to note that she could not be certain the impression had not been there before. She had not inspected the carpet that closely, had not been in the habit of examining it. She was also careful to note that she lived alone, that no one else had access to her apartment, and that the impression was not there the following day, as if whatever had made it had taken its weight back. The psychological impact of these encounters, accumulated over time, is documented in the accounts with a consistency that is itself worth examining. The initial response is almost always a form of paralysis, not sleep paralysis, but a conscious decision not to move, not to speak, not to draw attention. Witnesses describe this as instinctive rather than reasoned, as if some part of them recognized, on a level below conscious thought, that movement would be the wrong choice. As the encounters continue, this instinct calcifies into habit. People stop getting out of bed to check the hallway. They stop turning on lights. They develop elaborate stillness routines, lying in specific positions, controlling their breathing, avoiding any motion that might be perceptible through the gap beneath the door. They are, in other words, hiding. Hiding in their own beds, in their own rooms, from something they cannot identify. The reversal of safety that this represents is one of the most consistent and most disturbing elements of these accounts. The bedroom, the most private, the most enclosed, the most protected space in a home, becomes the location of maximum vulnerability. The door, which should represent security, becomes instead a membrane between the witness and something they desperately do not want to encounter directly. Several witnesses describe the period of the encounter as characterized by an acute awareness of their own physical presence, the sound of their own breathing, the motion of their own chest, the small shifts of their body in the bed. They become hyperconscious of themselves as objects in space, as things that can be detected, as things that might be detected. That word, detected, appears several times in independent accounts, always unprompted, always in the context of describing why the witness was trying so hard to be still. Not afraid of startling the presence exactly, afraid of being found. Elena Vasquez used that word in her account. She described at what she estimated was the 8th or 9th encounter. She had lost precise count, lying completely still for a duration she believed was over an hour, breathing as shallowly as she dared, convinced that whatever was outside her door was listening. Not just present, not just watching through the gap. Listening, attending to the sounds she was making, trying to determine whether she was awake. I kept thinking, she wrote, that if I was still enough, quiet enough, it would decide I was asleep and go away. I kept thinking that what it wanted was something that a sleeping person didn't have. I don't know why I thought that. I don't know what I thought it wanted. But I lay there for over an hour, absolutely convinced that waking consciousness was the thing I needed to hide. Marcus Webb had a similar experience, though he arrived at it differently. He was, by his 6th encounter, operating under a theory he was reluctant to put into writing, but felt compelled to document anyway. His theory, arrived at through months of observation and reasoning, was that the presence outside his door was not random. It was not drifting through the house and pausing at his door by chance. It was coming specifically for him, specifically to his door, with a purpose he could not identify but whose existence he could no longer doubt. I've thought about this a lot, he wrote, and I keep coming back to the same question. Why the door? Why stay on the other side of it? If it can be in my hallway without triggering a motion sensor, without making a sound on old floorboards, then it can presumably do other things without me knowing. It doesn't have to be at my door. It chooses to be at my door. Which means the door matters. The space between us matters. Whatever it is, it keeps the door between us deliberately. Marcus paused there in his account, and then added a line that has stayed with researchers who have read his submission. I've started to think that the door is for me, not for it. The door is for me, not for it. That line represents the darkest inflection point in these accounts. The moment when the witness moves from being frightened by what is outside the door to understanding, in some intuitive and unverifiable way, the nature of the dynamic. The presence does not need the door. It is not stopped by the door. It remains on the other side of the door as a kind of courtesy, as an accommodation, It keeps the door between you and itself, not because it must, but because, for reasons you cannot know, it has decided that is the appropriate arrangement, for now. That qualification, for now, is never stated explicitly in any of these accounts, but it is the unstated weight beneath all of them. The encounters, as they progress, carry an escalating quality that is not quite threat and not quite invitation, but something between them, something that makes the witnesses feel, consistently and without being able to articulate precisely why, that the arrangement is provisional, that the door and the distance it represents is an offer that could be withdrawn. Daniel Holt's account approaches this quality most directly because his encounters extended longest and were documented most carefully. By his 8th month, the presence had begun to arrive before he fell asleep. Not long before, perhaps 30 minutes, but enough that he was fully conscious and alert when the light beneath his bedroom door changed. He would be lying in bed, deliberately trying to sleep, and the room would shift in the subtle way he had learned to recognize, the quality of the silence changing, and he would know, without looking, that it was there. He never looked directly at the door during those extended periods. He developed a technique of peripheral observation, keeping his eyes toward the ceiling while tracking the light level at the edge of his vision. He believed, without evidence, but with considerable conviction, that direct eye contact with the gap would alter the dynamic in a way he did not want to test. That belief, that observation changes the nature of the encounter, that the presence can detect the quality of attention directed toward it, is another element common to these accounts. Witnesses describe modulating their gaze, their attention, their breathing, as if engaged in a negotiation with something acutely sensitive to their internal state, as if consciousness itself is what is being monitored. Daniel's log entry for what turned out to be his final encounter in the late summer of 2016 is the one that researchers return to most frequently. It is written in a different register than his previous entries, slightly more compressed, more careful, as if he were choosing each word with particular attention. He wrote that the presence arrived at approximately 1:55 in the morning, earlier than usual, while he was still fully awake. He tracked it peripherally for what he estimated was 40 minutes. He noted that during this period the acoustic quality of the hallway beyond his door was, in his words, occupied. Not the sounds of occupation, but the feeling of it. The way a room feels when it contains something, a compression of air, a sense of displacement. And then he wrote that something changed. He described it as a shift in orientation, that the presence, which had seemed to be simply standing in the hallway, was now. And he reached for the word carefully, crossed it out once, wrote it again. Attending. Not just present in the space, specifically actively directed toward him. Toward the specific wall of the room where he lay. Toward, as precisely as he could articulate, him. He described feeling, without any specific sensory input he could identify, a quality of focus that was not his own. A directed attention from outside the door that landed on him the way a searchlight lands on something in darkness. He lay perfectly still. He controlled his breathing. He watched the ceiling and did not move. He wrote, "I do not know if it knew I was awake. I do not know if the distinction matters to it. I lay there and understood, very clearly, that it was entirely aware of me, not discovering me, not sensing me for the first time. It had always known I was there. It had been coming to my door for 8 months because it knew I was there. I was the reason it came." He paused in the entry, indicated by a gap in the writing. The question I couldn't stop asking myself, lying there, was what I represented to it, why I was worth coming back to, over and over, for all these months, what it saw when it attended to me through that door. He paused again. The question I am less willing to write down is what it is waiting for. Marcus Webb did not experience a specific final encounter so much as a specific final realization. It came on his 9th incident, in early January of 2020. He was, by this point, sleeping with additional lights on, a lamp in the hallway, a lamp in the kitchen, flooding the gap beneath his bedroom door with as much light as possible, trying to make the shadow visible against a brighter backdrop. It worked, in the sense that it made the shadow more distinct. It did not work in any other sense. The increased light only made the darkness in the gap, when the presence arrived, more absolute by contrast, a shadow that swallowed the light around it rather than existing within it. He lay in bed on that January night and watched the shadow and thought about what he knew. He thought about the 9 months of encounters. He thought about the motion sensor that never triggered. He thought about the floorboards that never creaked. He thought about whatever had been outside his door for nearly a year, coming back again and again, with what was beginning to feel less like curiosity and more like patience. And then he thought about something he had not permitted himself to think about directly until that moment. He thought about the nights when he had not been aware of the presence, the nights when he had slept without incident, without waking, without the specific electricity of being watched pulling him to consciousness. He thought about what it meant that the presence could be outside his door on those nights, could have been there many times while he lay oblivious and sleeping, and he would never have known. He lay in the dark and looked at the shadow beneath his door and understood that what frightened him was not what was there. What frightened him was the recognition that the visibility of the encounter was a choice, that when the shadow was present, when the light was interrupted, it was because he was supposed to see it. That on the nights when he saw nothing, it was not because nothing was there. He wrote that this understanding arrived in his body before it arrived in his mind. A cold settling in the chest, a specific and very precise fear. The shadow resolved. The light returned to normal beneath his door. Marcus Webb lay in his bed until morning without moving or sleeping. He moved out of the house in March of 2020. He told himself it was due to the pandemic. Things were being disrupted for everyone. Leases were being restructured. It was a practical decision. He moved into an apartment on the 5th floor of a building with a doorman, a decision he described as having no particular significance, while also noting, without irony, that he chose it specifically because of those features. He has not experienced the phenomenon since. He was careful, in his account, to note that this may mean nothing, that the absence of the experience may simply mean it is not occurring in a form he can detect. Elena Vasquez still lives in the Pilsen apartment. The encounters stopped, for her, in approximately the spring of 2018, after a period of about 13 months. She does not know why they stopped. She does not know if stopped is the right word, or if it describes the situation accurately. What she wrote at the end of her account is that she has become a different kind of sleeper than she was before. That she is alert to things now that she never noticed previously. The quality of the silence. The air on the other side of the closed door. The way the light sits in the gap. I don't know what was outside my door, she wrote. I don't think I would have wanted to know. I think the door was, for whatever reason, a limit it respected. I think some part of me understood that the worst outcome was not that I would see it, but that I would open the door. And I never opened the door. She paused there. I'm not sure I could tell you why that felt so important, but I know that it did. I know that the door was something I needed to never, under any circumstances, open. And I know that this knowledge didn't come from reason. It came from whatever part of us still understands things we've stopped believing we need to know. And Daniel Holt still lives in the farmhouse outside Roanoke. The encounters stopped after August of 2016 and have not returned. When he speaks about them, and he speaks about them rarely, and only to people he trusts, he says that the house feels the same as it always did. He knows its sounds, its rhythms, its particular qualities of darkness and quiet. He knows the creak of the second stair from the top, the way the pipes settle in cold weather, the sound the hallway floorboards make under any weight significant enough to register. He says the farmhouse feels normal. He says he means that completely and sincerely. He also says, and this is the last thing he said to the researcher who collected his account, that there is one habit he has retained from those 8 months, one small thing that has stayed with him, built into his routine so thoroughly that he does it without thinking now, every night, as automatically as checking the locks. When he gets into bed, and when the lights are out, and when the house is quiet, he does not look at the gap beneath the bedroom door. He says he is not sure why he still does this. He says it may just be a habit, the kind of thing the body holds on to after the reason for it has passed. He says probably that's all it is. He says it without complete conviction. And that is where these accounts leave us, not with an explanation, not with a resolution, but with a question that none of the witnesses can answer, and that the phenomenon itself seems to have no interest in clarifying. What is on the other side of the door? What does it want, these presences that arrive without sound and leave without trace and return, again and again, with a patience that exceeds anything in the natural world? What is it watching for, in the dark hours of the morning, through the thin gap beneath the closed door of a sleeping room? We do not know. The witnesses do not know. The researchers who have spent years with these accounts do not know. What we know is that the accounts exist, in numbers large enough to constitute a pattern, across enough geography and demography to resist easy categorization. We know that they share specific details that the witnesses could not have borrowed from each other. We know that the experiences are real to the people who had them, real in the way that only things which genuinely occur are real, with residue, with consequences, with the specific gravity of an event that leaves you changed in ways you cannot fully account for. And we know, or at least we can reasonably suspect, based on the pattern of these accounts and the sheer ordinariness of the people involved, that wherever you are reading or listening to this, you are probably not very far from a door, that door has a gap beneath it, that beyond the gap is darkness or the suggestion of light, and that the space between you and whatever is on the other side of it is, in the end, very thin. Most nights, nothing is there. Most nights, the light under the door is just light. The silence beyond it is just silence. The darkness is empty and the house is at rest, and whatever is in the world that visits places like this has not, on this particular night, found its way to you. Most nights,